So Zoe, just let me know when you want this slide advanced.
Sure, advance. We're looking at wealth appropriation on College Hill. So just as a definition, wealth appropriation in general, as I said a few minutes ago, is a process by which governments or private organizations deprive communities of color of wealth and opportunities to build wealth. And we're looking at it specifically through the lens of intentional housing policies. The three facets of this are redlining and day-to-day discrimination, disinvestment, so that local officials can make an area appear blighted, even though the quote unquote blight is their disinvestment and not the community's fault. And third, which is our focus, is urban renewal and development projects targeting these communities, displacing them and destroying their accumulated and potential wealth. Next slide. So Providence, like every other city in America, has a long history, sorry about my dog, of appropriating wealth from people of color. We're looking specifically after the creation of the I-95 highway throughout the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, and with a focus on Lippitt Hill project. Other areas that were affected were Fox Point, Mashapaug Pond, and Willard Avenue.
So looking at this, to start quantifying it, we started out by going through the city of Providence's archival ortho imagery or aerial photographs of the city, and using that and a couple of different records we had on hand of some of the larger urban renewal projects that had occurred and other large private developments. We digitized sort of the boundaries of a lot of these projects and tried to figure out where spatially they were occurring, and overlaid this for a preliminary analysis using the digitized redlining maps that the University of Richmond provides, and use this to sort of identify projects that would be of particular interest. We had data from another project that had median housing value, among other attributes, for census blocks since the 1950s, and taking those mean housing values and moving them to 2020 inflation, it was possible for us to take a look at what the market-based inflation of value was. For other impacts, we decided to do a literature review. So going through this redlining map and the initial start we were able to get for some of the urban renewal projects, you see pretty much exclusively the projects occurred in the lower C and D grades, which is really an important thing to look at in this, especially since a lot of other projects and research I found that the majority of the disparities that redlining forced happened between the C and D brackets, but then particularly between the B and C brackets. So focusing in on this change over time, as we flip from 1950 to 70 to 90 to most recently 2013, we see over the course of time, all housing values across College Hill that have been normalized to $20 increasing substantially. And if we look at how this affects the percent change, we see that the largest percent changes occur on College Hill and specifically around the university and very heavily on Benefit Street. We also see that the Lippitt Hill project makes a really good case study for this development, since there's a really high cluster of increasing property values around it, but then also some of those that didn't have as much. It is important to make the caveat with this data that the census didn't measure or digitize things the same way. So, for example, this is Swan Point Cemetery and should not have a mean housing value, but does in this area. So there's definitely much more work that needs to be done there. But looking at Lippitt Hill as a specific case study in this, we looked at the blocks directly adjacent to the Lippitt Hill development to create a counterfactual. to sort of say, okay, what would have happened if residents were able to stay in that direct area? We found that based on the mean housing value changed over time, the average house increased in value by 316%, so a factor of 4.2. And then looking at the Lippitt Hill project, the Providence Journal reported that 85 to 90% of residents stayed in the general vicinity, but moved to other areas. So we selected for neighborhoods that had a percent increase in Black population or non-white population and over the 60 to 70 time bracket, and then filtered that for the most nearby streets and found that that only had about 2.7 times increase. Just visualizing this, that meant that the wealth created by home value increasing was 49.5% higher in the adjacent blocks to the development. Zoe?
Great. So additionally, we wanted to look at other factors that deprived these communities of color of wealth building opportunities. So here is just a sample from the Providence City Archives of some other projects that happened in the 50s and 60s. So 3 of the socioeconomic factors that influenced, that were ways in which wealth was appropriated were business, health, and community. So looking at business first, specifically Lippitt Hill, there were a lot of African-American businesses that were displaced and destroyed during the urban renewal in the 50s and 60s. And Black unemployment has been historically higher than white unemployment and still is today. And Black-owned businesses and majority Black employed businesses tend to employ more Black folks. So this meant that when these, and provide less, and there's less turnover in jobs. So that means that these communities were deprived of these secure wages when these businesses were destroyed. And of course, wages contribute to wealth building capacity. Next slide. So another factor is health, and while it's obscene to try to think about measuring health in terms of monetary value, especially given that urban renewal can shorten and displacement by urban renewal can shorten folks' lives. Just looking at some of the healthcare costs that people incurred due to displacement by urban renewal, shorter life expectancy, higher cancer rates, more birth defects, and pre-existing health conditions were worsened. Next slide. Yeah, so community, even people who were not displaced lost the community because the displacement disrupted the community networking and sense of community that was going on. People who were not displaced or were displaced suffer from depression and anxiety, which can lead to lower wages, and strong community connections increase economic activity for the community. So this was another form of the way that people were deprived of wealth building capacity. You can go on ahead to.
Muted myself. So moving from this, all of the computational results should be taken with a huge grain of salt, since generalizing from census data allows us to identify some general trends, but the data itself isn't the best estimate of housing values. And if we want more concrete results that we can study and look more into, we identified Sanborn maps, the plat maps, and more recent modern tax assessment data as a way to get data that was linked specifically to individual houses, and a way that you could, or that future research could possibly digitize the shapes of buildings and do a much better change over time visualization, and also have more comprehensive analysis that starts to include impacts on businesses and renters. We also got to start on looking into some of the overall plans made by the university and by various different government and private entities, but that's also a really huge area for future researchers to look into, specifically in the realm of wealth appropriation. That's all.
Thank you. Do we have any questions? Is that you? Yeah, right? You ready for questions?
Mm-hmm. We're good.
Okay.
Sorry.
Question?
Yes, please.
Is that for me, Danny?
Yes.
This is a very important, first of all, thank you all for your work. This is extremely important, looking at the empirical database, which has been long overdue. And I want to just direct the attention as you begin to fine tune this metadata, because it complements a lot of what, I'm SPIA Media Production, but I'm also the director of the Fox Point Cape Verdean Heritage Project, and we're the descendants of the founding families of Fox Point. And we have the major repository of all the documents of the main institutions historically in the Cape Verdean community from the 1930s till we were displaced. And that, excuse me, includes a lot of health data, because the largest beneficent association in Fox Point, which was the first corporation in Rhode Island, Cape Verdean, was one that provided health and death benefits. And so I have all the membership forms, because you had to be reviewed by the board, because it was dues paying and it paid health and death benefits. So there was very specific health information about current health, diseases, age, place, and addresses. So this is a database that at some point will give the fine-tuning accuracy, because of at the peak before we were displaced, there were probably 300 members of San Antonio, which would be every major kinship group in Fox Point. And that would really help in terms of honing the official city data. And it's very important, it's imperative to understand the census data. And Keith raised this point. There's a conflation of race. So many Cape Verdeans, and I know this anecdotally and as a scholar, did not, like, and it's still happening now, we're fighting with the census, because there's nothing that allows an indication of Cape Verdean. So people will oftentimes do nothing or other, and being able to parse that distinction is critical in Fox Point, absolutely critical. The second part, as you begin to aggregate the maps and the other data of the blocks, please, because we're also reconstituting where our major community houses were on South Main Street. What happened was all of those were bulldozed before, and there were houses behind the South Main Street one that were connected to those. And we've been painstakingly going from Planet Street to Transit to house by house, reinsert the houses that are gone. So you're going to find that the addresses no longer coincide consistently over a period of time. So there were houses that were house numbered on Planet Street. After the gentrification, they no longer number the houses on Planet Street, they were South Main Street. Also, there were other streets like John Street where the houses were totally bulldozed or moved. So you're going to find there's a lot of confusion between the city records that must be compared empirically with the metadata of the community institutions that have the people's addresses from the 30s to the 70s in that particular block. So I want to put that forward as you begin to refine your data, because those records do not exist in the city's archives. Okay, thank you. But it's very important. It's very important. Thank you.
Thanks.
You're right. That's we were looking through the data the city had, and that's definitely not there. So that will be incredibly useful for future research, especially as projects start looking in other areas.
Yes, I look forward to working with you with the database because we'll really hone in a lot of these very important parameters that you're beginning to accurately frame the bigger picture. Thank you for this.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm going to, we should move on to the next one. So we have more time at the end because we're running a little bit behind now, of course.